As they left the aircraft, Rebecca was escorted to a secure area of the airport where FBI agents had established a temporary command center. The sight of federal investigators with their computers and communication equipment reminded her of the serious nature of the threats facing the aviation industry. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh introduced herself as the lead investigator on the case. Her professional demeanor and extensive knowledge of aviation security issues impressed Rebecca, who felt confident that the investigation was in capable hands. Captain Martinez. I want to start by saying that Captain Rebecca Martinez had been flying commercial jets for Trans-Global Airways for 12 years, but nothing had prepared her for what happened on Flight 447 from Denver to Miami. The Boeing 737 was cruising at 35,000 feet when her co-pilot, James Wilson, noticed something unusual on the radar display. Multiple aircraft were approaching their position at high speed, moving in formation patterns that could only mean one thing: military interceptors. Rebecca's hands tightened on the controls as she watched the green blips converge on their location. The radio crackled to life with an authoritative voice demanding immediate compliance. Transglobal 447, this is Falcon Lead. You are ordered to change course immediately and follow our escort to the nearest military airfield. Do not deviate from our instructions. The passengers in the cabin remained unaware of the drama unfolding in the cockpit. Rebecca's heart raced as she tried to understand what was happening. Her flight plan had been approved through all proper channels, and she had clearance for the entire route. There was no reason for military intervention unless something had gone terribly wrong. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the sleek forms of F-16 fighting Falcons positioning themselves around her aircraft. The lead fighter had pulled alongside, close enough that she could see the pilot's helmet and oxygen mask. The sight sent chills down her spine as she realized the gravity of the situation. Falcon Lead, this is Transglobal 447, Rebecca responded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Please advise the nature of this intercept. We are on a scheduled commercial flight with proper clearances and pose no threat to national security. The response came back immediately, cold and uncompromising. Transglobal 447, you have violated restricted airspace during a classified military operation. Your aircraft is considered a potential security risk. Comply with escort instructions immediately or face the consequences. Rebecca's mind raced as she tried to process this information. She had studied the flight plan meticulously, as she always did. Every waypoint, every altitude change, every restricted area had been carefully noted and avoided. Her navigation systems showed they were exactly where they were supposed to be, following the approved route provided by air traffic control. Co-pilot Wilson was frantically checking their position on backup systems, his face pale with concern. "Captain, according to all our instruments, we're exactly on course. I don't understand how we could have violated any restricted airspace." The lead F-16 pilot's voice came through again, this time with increased urgency. "Transglobal 447, you have 30 seconds to begin course correction to heading 270, or we will be forced to take defensive action. This is your final warning." Rebecca felt sweat beading on her forehead as she weighed her options. The lives of 156 passengers and crew members were in her hands, and she had to make a decision that could determine their fate. She had never been in a situation like this, despite all her years of experience and training. Something about the situation felt wrong, but she couldn't afford to take chances with her passengers' safety. "Falcon Lead, Transglobal 447 is complying with your instructions. Beginning turn to heading 270 now." She banked the aircraft gently, her years of training taking over as she maintained smooth flight characteristics to avoid alarming the passengers. As they changed course, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that this was all a terrible mistake. She had spent countless hours studying airspace restrictions and had never encountered anything like this on her regular route. The military pilots seemed convinced of their violation, but every instrument in her cockpit told a different story. The F-16s maintained their escort formation as they guided the commercial airliner toward an unfamiliar military installation. Rebecca could see the runway approaching in the distance, surrounded by the stark concrete buildings and security fencing typical of military bases. This was definitely not part of her planned route to Miami. "Transglobal 447, you are cleared to land on runway 09. Ground personnel will direct you to a secure parking area where you will be met by base security. Do not attempt to taxi without explicit clearance," the lead pilot instructed. Rebecca acknowledged the instructions and began her approach procedures. The landing was smooth despite the unusual circumstances, and she was grateful for her extensive training that allowed her to maintain professional composure under pressure. As they touched down, she could see military vehicles racing alongside the runway, their flashing lights creating an ominous atmosphere. The aircraft rolled to a stop at the designated area, surrounded by armed personnel and official vehicles. Rebecca shut down the engines and tried to prepare herself for whatever was about to happen. She had no idea what charges might be brought against her, or what consequences she might face for this alleged airspace violation. Through the small cockpit window, she watched as a group of stern-faced military officials approached the aircraft. Their body language suggested this was a serious matter, and Rebecca felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had always prided herself on being a careful, professional pilot who followed all regulations to the letter. Co-pilot Wilson was equally nervous, continuously checking and rechecking their navigation logs as if hoping to find some explanation for the situation. "Captain, I've gone through everything 3 times. Our flight plan was approved, our route was standard, and we never deviated from the assigned path. I don't understand how this could have happened." The cabin crew had begun to notice the unusual circumstances, and Rebecca knew it would only be a matter of time before passengers started asking questions. She needed to make an announcement soon, but she wasn't sure what to tell them. How do you explain to paying customers that their routine flight has been intercepted by military fighters? Before she could formulate a response, there was a sharp knock on the cockpit door. Rebecca opened it to find a military officer in dress uniform, his face grave and authoritative. "Captain Martinez, I'm Colonel Thompson. You and your crew need to come with me immediately. The passengers will remain on board until this matter is resolved." Rebecca stepped out of the cockpit, her mind racing with questions and concerns. As they walked through the cabin, she could see the confusion and worry on passengers' faces. Many were looking out the windows at the military vehicles and personnel surrounding the aircraft. The tension in the air was palpable. Colonel Thompson led them to a secure building where they were separated into different rooms for individual questioning. Rebecca found herself in a sterile interrogation room with fluorescent lighting and no windows. The stark environment made her feel like a criminal, even though she knew she had done nothing wrong. The questioning began immediately. A stern-faced intelligence officer named Major Davis demanded to know why she had violated restricted airspace during a classified military exercise. Rebecca explained repeatedly that she had followed her approved flight plan exactly, but the officer seemed unconvinced. "Captain Martinez, are you telling me that you accidentally flew through some of the most restricted airspace in the country without realizing it?" Major Davis asked, his tone skeptical and accusatory. Rebecca maintained her composure, though inside she was growing increasingly frustrated. "Major, I followed the exact route provided by air traffic control. My navigation systems showed we were on course throughout the entire flight. If there was restricted airspace in our path, it wasn't properly communicated to us." The interrogation continued for hours, with the same questions repeated over and over. Rebecca began to feel like she was being treated as a potential terrorist, rather than an experienced commercial pilot who had simply been doing her job. The military personnel seemed convinced that she had deliberately violated their airspace, despite her consistent denials. During a brief break, Rebecca was allowed to call her airline's legal department. The conversation was tense, with executives expressing concern about the potential damage to the company's reputation. She could hear the worry in their voices as they discussed the possibility of federal charges and regulatory action. When the questioning resumed, Rebecca noticed a change in the officers' demeanor. They had been joined by a new figure, an older military pilot whose flight suit bore the insignia of a squadron commander. He studied Rebecca carefully, his eyes focusing on something that seemed to catch his attention. "Captain Martinez, where did you get that badge on your uniform?" he asked, pointing to a small pin on her left sleeve that she had worn for years without thinking about it. Rebecca glanced down at the badge, surprised by the question. It's a mission completion badge from Operation Desert Storm. I served as a military transport pilot before transitioning to commercial aviation. I was part of the airlift operations that supported ground forces during the conflict. The squadron commander's expression changed dramatically. He leaned forward, studying the badge more closely, and Rebecca could see recognition dawning in his eyes. "Captain Martinez, what unit were you with during Desert Storm? And what specific operations did you participate in?" Rebecca sensed that this line of questioning might be important, so she answered as completely as possible. "I was with the 437th Airlift Wing, flying C-141 Starlifters. My primary missions involved transporting wounded personnel from forward medical facilities to base hospitals in Germany. I also participated in several supply drops to isolated ground units who were cut off from normal supply lines." The commander's demeanor softened considerably, and he turned to the other officers in the room. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding here. Captain Martinez, do you remember a particular mission in February 1991 where you evacuated wounded soldiers from a makeshift landing strip near the Kuwaiti border?" Rebecca's mind raced back to those intense days of the conflict. There had been so many missions, so many wounded soldiers, that individual flights sometimes blurred together. But one mission stood out in her memory because of its unusual circumstances and the desperate nature of the evacuation. "Yes, I remember that mission. It was extremely dangerous because the landing strip was still within range of enemy artillery. We had to make a combat approach and departure, and the whole operation took place under cover of darkness. There were 12 wounded soldiers on board, including several who were in critical condition." The squadron commander nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting memories of his own. "Captain, my name is Colonel Michael Harrison. I was a young F-16 pilot during Desert Storm, and I was one of the pilots providing air cover for that exact evacuation mission. You saved the life of my best friend that night." The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. Major Davis looked confused and concerned, clearly unsure how this information affected their investigation. The other officers exchanged glances, recognizing that the situation had taken an unexpected turn. Colonel Harrison continued, his voice filled with emotion. Captain Martinez, Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, was critically wounded when his unit was ambushed during a reconnaissance mission. The doctors said he had maybe 6 hours to live without immediate surgery. Your willingness to land in that hostile zone and evacuate those wounded soldiers saved his life and the lives of 11 other servicemen. Rebecca felt a flood of memories returning from that dangerous night. She remembered the urgency in the ground commander's voice as he described the wounded soldiers who needed immediate evacuation. The landing strip had been hastily constructed and was barely long enough for her aircraft, but there had been no choice. "I remember Jake Morrison," she said quietly. "He was unconscious when we loaded him onto the aircraft, but I could see how badly injured he was. The medics worked on him during the entire flight to Germany. I always wondered if he survived." Colonel Harrison smiled for the first time since entering the room. Not only did he survive, but he went on to have a distinguished military career. He's now a senior master sergeant and has saved countless lives as a flight medic. He often talks about the pilot who risked everything to get him out of that combat zone. The atmosphere in the interrogation room had completely transformed. Major Davis and the other officers were beginning to realize that they might have made a serious error in their assessment of the situation. Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and vindication, but she was still concerned about the original problem of the alleged airspace violation. "Colonel Harrison, I appreciate you sharing that information, but we still need to address why my aircraft was intercepted today. I maintain that I followed my approved flight plan exactly, and I have no idea how we could have violated restricted airspace," Rebecca said, maintaining her professional composure despite the emotional moment. Colonel Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Captain Martinez, I believe there may have been a serious communication breakdown between air traffic control and military operations. Let me make some calls and get to the bottom of this situation. Your service record and character speak for themselves, and I find it highly unlikely that you would deliberately violate restricted airspace." As Colonel Harrison left the room to investigate, Rebecca found herself alone with Major Davis, who now seemed much less hostile than before. The major appeared to be reevaluating his assumptions about the situation, and Rebecca could see uncertainty in his expressions. "Captain Martinez, I want to apologize for the aggressive nature of our questioning," Major Davis said, his tone more respectful than before. "When military aircraft intercept a civilian plane during a classified operation, we have to assume the worst-case scenario. but your military background and Colonel Harrison's testimony certainly change the context of this situation." Rebecca appreciated the apology, but she was still deeply concerned about the potential consequences for her career and her airline. "Major, I understand the need for security, but this incident could have serious repercussions for my passengers, my crew, and my company. We need to resolve this matter quickly and determine exactly what went wrong." 30 minutes later, Colonel Harrison returned with a grim expression and a folder full of documents. "Captain Martinez, I have some very disturbing news. It appears that someone in the air traffic control system deliberately provided you with a flight plan that would take you through restricted airspace during our training exercise." Rebecca felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean, deliberately? Are you saying this was sabotage?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Colonel Harrison replied, opening the folder to reveal a stack of communications records. "We've discovered that your original flight plan was altered by someone with access to the air traffic control system. The changes were made in such a way that you would unknowingly violate restricted airspace during our classified training mission." The implications of this revelation were staggering. Rebecca realized that someone had deliberately put her, her crew, and her passengers in danger as part of some unknown agenda. The thought that she had been used as an unwitting pawn in someone else's scheme made her feel sick. "Do you know who did this?" Rebecca asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. Colonel Harrison's expression was grave. "We're still investigating, but we have strong suspicions about who might be responsible. This appears to be connected to a larger pattern of security breaches that we've been tracking for several months." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the full scope of what had happened. Someone had deliberately manipulated the air traffic control system to put her aircraft in harm's way, potentially endangering the lives of everyone on board. The thought that this was part of a larger conspiracy made the situation even more frightening. "Colonel, who would have the access and motivation to do something like this?" Rebecca asked, her mind racing through the possibilities. "And why would they target my specific flight?" Colonel Harrison exchanged glances with Major Davis before responding. "We believe this may be connected to a disgruntled former air traffic controller named Marcus Powell. He was terminated from his position at Denver International Airport 6 months ago for security violations, and has been making threats against both the FAA and military aviation authorities." The name meant nothing to Rebecca, but the implications were clear. Someone with inside knowledge of air traffic control systems had deliberately set her up to fail, putting her career and the lives of her passengers at risk. The violation of trust felt like a personal attack on everything she had worked for in her aviation career. "We've been tracking Powell's activities since his termination," Major Davis added. "He's been attempting to gain unauthorized access to various aviation databases and has been in contact with individuals who have expressed anti-government sentiments. This appears to be his most serious breach yet." Rebecca felt a surge of anger at the thought that someone would use innocent passengers as pawns in their personal vendetta against the aviation authorities. The passengers on her flight had trusted her to get them safely to their destination, and they had been unknowingly placed in danger by someone else's malicious actions. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked, concerned about the immediate safety of her passengers and crew. "My passengers have been sitting on that aircraft for hours without any explanation. They deserve to know what's happening, and they need to get to their destination." Colonel Harrison nodded understandingly. "Captain Martinez, first let me assure you that you and your crew are completely cleared of any wrongdoing. You were victims of a deliberate act of sabotage, and we will be providing full documentation of this fact to your airline and the FAA. Your passengers will be taken care of, and we'll arrange for them to continue their journey to Miami as soon as possible." Rebecca felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she was still concerned about the broader implications of the situation. "Colonel, what about Powell? Has he been arrested? And what measures are being taken to prevent this from happening again?" "That's where things get complicated," Colonel Harrison replied, his expression darkening. "Powell has disappeared, and we believe he may have fled the country. We're working with federal authorities to track him down, but he had several days to cover his tracks before we discovered the extent of his sabotage." The thought that the person responsible for this incident was still at large made Rebecca uncomfortable. She wondered if there might be additional threats to aviation security that hadn't been discovered yet. The idea that someone could manipulate air traffic control systems so easily was deeply disturbing. "Captain Martinez, I want you to know that your handling of this situation was exemplary," Colonel Harrison continued. "When faced with military interceptors, you remained calm and professional, putting the safety of your passengers above all other considerations. That's exactly the kind of leadership we expect from someone with your background." Rebecca appreciated the recognition, but her primary concern remained the safety and well-being of her passengers. She had been trained to handle emergency situations, but nothing had prepared her for being deliberately sabotaged by someone with access to critical aviation systems. As they prepared to return to the aircraft, Colonel Harrison pulled Rebecca aside for a private conversation. "Captain, there's something else you need to know. The investigation into Powell's activities has revealed that this wasn't his first attempt at sabotage. We believe he may have been responsible for several other incidents over the past few months, including near misses between military and civilian aircraft. The revelation that other pilots and passengers had been endangered by Powell's actions made Rebecca's anger burn even hotter. The sacred trust between air traffic controllers and pilots was fundamental to aviation safety, and Powell had violated that trust in the most dangerous way possible. "Has anyone been hurt in these other incidents?" Rebecca asked, dreading the answer. "Fortunately, no," Colonel Harrison replied. "But it was only a matter of time before someone got seriously injured or killed. Your incident was the most serious yet because of the number of passengers involved and the potential for a catastrophic misunderstanding between our fighters and your aircraft." Rebecca realized how close they had come to disaster. If the military pilots had been less restrained, or if she had made any sudden moves that could have been interpreted as hostile, the situation could have escalated into a tragedy. The thought of innocent passengers being harmed because of one person's vendetta was almost too much to bear. When they returned to the aircraft, Rebecca was relieved to see that the passengers were being well cared for by military personnel. Food and beverages had been provided, and medical staff was available for anyone who needed assistance. The military had gone to great lengths to minimize the impact on the innocent travelers. Rebecca made an announcement to the passengers, explaining that there had been a communication error with air traffic control that had been resolved. She apologized for the delay and inconvenience, assuring them that they would be continuing to Miami shortly. She chose not to mention the sabotage, knowing that such information would only cause additional anxiety. As the passengers disembarked to stretch their legs and use the facilities, Rebecca noticed that several of them approached her personally to thank her for her professionalism during the unexpected situation. Many commented on how calm and reassuring her announcements had been, even though they could sense that something unusual was happening. One elderly passenger, a retired airline pilot himself, took her aside to express his admiration for her handling of the situation. "Captain, I've been flying for 50 years, and I could tell this wasn't a routine diversion. Whatever happened up there, you kept us safe, and that's what matters most." His words meant more to Rebecca than any official commendation could. The trust that passengers placed in their pilots was sacred, and she had managed to honor that trust even while being manipulated by someone with malicious intent. While the aircraft was being refueled and inspected by military technicians, Rebecca had time to reflect on the day's events. The discovery of Marcus Powell's sabotage had turned her from a suspected security threat into a victim of a deliberate attack on aviation safety. Colonel Harrison approached her with updates on the investigation. "Captain Martinez, I wanted to let you know that the FBI has taken over the case. They're treating this as an act of domestic terrorism, given the potential for mass casualties and the deliberate nature of the attack on critical infrastructure. The escalation to federal involvement underscored the seriousness of what had happened. Rebecca realized that she would likely be involved in ongoing investigations and legal proceedings for months to come. The thought of reliving this experience repeatedly through testimony and depositions was exhausting. "What about other flights?" Rebecca asked, concerned about the broader implications for aviation security. "If Powell could manipulate my flight plan, what's to stop him or others from doing the same thing to other aircraft?" Colonel Harrison's expression was grim. "That's our biggest concern right now. The FAA is conducting a comprehensive review of all air traffic control systems to identify any other unauthorized modifications. In the meantime, additional security measures have been implemented to prevent similar incidents." Rebecca felt some relief knowing that steps were being taken to prevent future attacks, but she was still troubled by the vulnerability that had been exposed. The aviation system depended on trust and cooperation between multiple agencies and organizations, and Powell had exploited that trust in a way that could have had catastrophic consequences. As preparations for departure continued, Rebecca received a call from her airline's CEO, David Anderson. His voice was filled with concern and gratitude as he expressed the company's support for her actions during the crisis. "Captain Martinez, I want you to know that the entire company is behind you 100%, Anderson said. "Your professionalism and quick thinking prevented what could have been a disaster for our passengers and our industry. We're going to do everything possible to support you through this investigation." Rebecca appreciated the company's backing, but she was also aware that the incident would have lasting effects on her career and reputation. Even though she had been cleared of any wrongdoing, being involved in such a high-profile security incident would follow her for years to come. The conversation with Anderson also revealed the broader impact of Powell's actions on the aviation industry. Several other airlines had reported similar communication anomalies in recent months, suggesting that the sabotage campaign had been more extensive than initially realized. "David, I'm concerned about how this is going to affect public confidence in air travel," Rebecca said. "If passengers start to worry about the security of air traffic control systems, it could have serious consequences for the entire industry." Anderson acknowledged her concerns, but emphasized that transparency and accountability would be essential in maintaining public trust. "We're going to work with federal authorities to ensure that passengers understand what happened and what steps are being taken to prevent similar incidents in the future." As they prepared to continue their journey to Miami, Rebecca couldn't help but think about the chain of events that had led to this moment. If Colonel Harrison hadn't recognized her Desert Storm Service badge, the outcome might have been very different. The military investigators might have continued to treat her as a suspected security threat rather than a victim of sabotage. The irony wasn't lost on her that her military service, which had happened more than 30 years ago, had ultimately saved her career and possibly her life. The badge she wore to honor her fallen comrades had become the key to her vindication in this modern crisis. 2 hours after landing, Transglobal Flight 447 was finally cleared for departure. The passengers reboarded with a mixture of curiosity and relief, grateful to be continuing their journey, but still uncertain about what had caused the unexpected delay. Rebecca conducted her pre-flight checks with extra care, knowing that every system had been thoroughly inspected by military technicians. As they taxied toward the runway, Rebecca reflected on the professional relationships that had been forged during this crisis. Colonel Harrison had provided her with his personal contact information, expressing hope that they could stay in touch and share their experiences with other military and civilian aviation professionals. The takeoff was smooth, and Rebecca felt a sense of relief as they climbed back to cruising altitude. The remainder of the flight to Miami proceeded without incident, but she remained hyper-aware of every radio communication and navigation update, knowing that her trust in the air traffic control system had been fundamentally shaken. During the flight, co-pilot Wilson expressed his admiration for Rebecca's handling of the situation. "Captain, I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone maintain their composure under that kind of pressure. When those F-16s appeared, I thought we were all going to end up in federal prison." Rebecca appreciated his words, but she was still processing the emotional impact of the day's events. Being accused of endangering national security, even temporarily, had been one of the most stressful experiences of her career. The knowledge that she had been deliberately targeted by someone with malicious intent made it even more difficult to accept. As they approached Miami International Airport, Rebecca made a final announcement to the passengers, thanking them for their patience and understanding during the unusual circumstances. She chose her words carefully, knowing that many of them would likely share their experiences on social media and with news outlets. The landing in Miami was routine, but Rebecca could see that word of the incident had already spread. News trucks were positioned around the airport, and she could see reporters and cameramen preparing to document their arrival. The thought of facing media scrutiny added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming day. After parking at the gate and completing shutdown procedures, Rebecca was approached by airline executives and federal agents who were waiting to continue the investigation. The FBI had arrived in Miami to interview her and the crew members, and she knew that the next few hours would be crucial in building the case against Marcus Powell. The passenger deplaning process was delayed as federal agents quietly identified and interviewed several travelers who might have witnessed or recorded relevant information during the incident. Rebecca watched through the cockpit window as passengers were thanked for their cooperation and provided with contact information for follow-up questions. One passenger, a technology executive named Robert Chen, approached Rebecca as she prepared to leave the aircraft. "Captain, I want you to know that your calm leadership during that situation was remarkable. I've been on hundreds of flights, and I've never felt safer than I did under your command today." His words provided some comfort, but Rebecca knew that the real test would come in the days and weeks ahead as the investigation continued and media attention intensified. She had become an unwitting central figure in a case that would likely have national implications for aviation security. As they left the aircraft, Rebecca was escorted to a secure area of the airport where FBI agents had established a temporary command center. The sight of federal investigators with their computers and communication equipment reminded her of the serious nature of the threats facing the aviation industry.